Ariel drove her open palm against the shimmering barrier, the impact vibrating through her arm and into her shoulder. The field hummed, a jagged, discordant sound that bit into her skin. She pushed harder, channeling her remaining energy into her fingertips. The light of the containment wall flared, then sputtered like a dying candle. She clawed at the surface, but the magic held firm, repelling her touch with a sharp, static snap. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stepped back, her knees hitting the floor with a dull thud. Every ounce of her internal reserve had been spent on that single, desperate strike. She watched the wall for a sign of weakness, but the shimmering glow remained unbroken. Her hands trembled. The air inside the box felt thin and metallic, tasting of ozone and failure. She tried to steady her breathing, but her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that filled the silence. The glow of the barrier pulsed once, twice, and then dimmed to a faint, mocking flicker. She leaned her forehead against the cold surface, the energy drain leaving her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The escape attempt had cost her everything, and the walls remained. The silence did not last. Deep within the architecture of the academy, a new sound began to permeate the stone. It started as a faint, rhythmic clicking, a sharp metallic strike against the floor that echoed through the ventilation shafts. Ariel lifted her head, her ears straining against the heavy air. The sound grew, gaining speed and weight with every beat. It was not a footfall, but the calculated, hydraulic shift of heavy machinery grinding against bone and floor. The clicking resonated, vibrating through the containment box and into the very ground beneath her. It was the sound of the headmaster's guard. The cadence was precise, devoid of hesitation, turning the hallway into a corridor of singular focus. Each click was a hammer blow against the stillness of the ward. The floor plates groaned under the weight of the approaching suits. Ariel gripped her knees, her muscles locking in anticipation as the sound reached the outer chamber. The mechanical hum grew louder, a low-frequency drone that drowned out the ambient magic of the academy. There was no room for error, no space for hiding. The rhythm stopped just outside the heavy entrance, the silence that followed heavier and more suffocating than the noise itself. The trap was closing. Stephanie stood inches from the release lever, her hand hovering in the empty air. She did not pull it. Her gaze remained fixed on the corridor outside the containment chamber, where the automated sentries paced with relentless precision. The light from the hallway caught the hollows of her cheeks, revealing a pallor that had not been there hours before. Her knuckles were white, locked against the cold metal of the control panel. Yesterday, she had paced this same floor with a sharp tongue, mocking the limits of magic, but the current silence was heavy, with a new kind of finality. She watched the guard turn the corner, its mechanical joints hissing as it scanned the floor for unauthorized heat signatures. Stephanie flinched. She drew her shoulders in, making herself small, as if proximity to the wall could render her invisible. The arrogance that had defined her presence in the academy for months had drained away, leaving only a wide-eyed, frantic alertness. She did not look at the box where Ariel lay, nor did she acknowledge the hum of the failing wards. She simply stared at the patrolling shadows, her breathing shallow and jagged, paralyzed by the weight of the danger she had once underestimated. The lever remained untouched, a silent witness to her sudden, absolute fear. Ariel shifted her weight, the movement causing the containment walls to pulse with a dying, erratic violet light. She watched Stephanie through the translucent barrier. The distance between them had been vast only a day ago, defined by Stephanie's sharp, cutting remarks about Ariel's inability to focus her energy. Now, that distance had collapsed into a shared, suffocating reality. Ariel studied the way Stephanie's eyes darted toward the hallway, searching for an escape that did not exist. The memory of yesterday's lecture, the way Stephanie had stood over her, mocking the flickering potential of her hands, felt like a lifetime ago. The irony was cold and sharp. The authority Stephanie had wielded with such ease had been stripped away, replaced by the same raw, trembling fear that Ariel was forced to endure. They were both trapped in the same machinery of the academy. Ariel pressed her palm against the cold surface of the box, feeling the vibration of the headmaster's gods moving nearby. She did not feel anger at the memory, She felt a grim clarity. The hierarchy of their classroom had dissolved under the shadow of the headmaster's tyranny, leaving them as equals in a losing game. Stephanie's hand remained frozen, hovering near the lever, and for the first time, Ariel saw the truth. Their survival was no longer a question of skill, but of who would move first, before the light went out entirely. The hallway remained drowned in shadow. The only sound, the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the automated sentries patrolling the far end of the wing. Then, movement flickered near the intersection of the west corridor. Jacqueline stepped from behind a heavy stone pillar, her fingers already beginning to glow. A steady, rhythmic pulse of violet light radiated from her fingertips, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. She did not rush. She kept her back pressed flush against the masonry, her eyes scanning the ceiling for the hidden sensors that govern the Academy's security grid. The light from her hand hummed, a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness of the hall. She reached the corner and paused, tilting her head to listen to the mechanical whir of a guard unit passing just feet away. Once the sound faded into the distance, she turned back to the darkness behind her. With a sharp, precise gesture of her hand, she beckoned the others forward. Her face was set in a mask of intense focus, every muscle coiled for immediate reaction. She did not speak. The mission demanded absolute precision. With a final check of the control panel near the office, she stepped out from the concealment of the pillars, leading the group toward the containment chamber. The risk was absolute, but the violet light in her hand remained unwavering. The group moved as a single, fluid shadow through the Academy's heart. They kept their feet light, avoiding the resonant stone tiles that might betray their position to the sensors embedded in the walls. Every step was calculated, a synchronized dance of caution. Jacqueline led the way, her violet light dimmed to a faint, pulsing ember that barely touched the floor. Behind her, the others followed in tight formation, eyes tracking the overhead conduits and the shifting patterns of the automated sentries. The air in the corridor grew colder as they descended deeper into the facility, tasting of ozone and metallic dust. They pressed into the narrow gaps between the structural supports whenever the faint, rhythmic whir of a patrol echoed from a nearby wing. Nobody spoke. Communication was reduced to sharp glances and subtle hand signals that cut through the gloom. Their pulses hammered against their ribs, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant, mechanical grinding of the Academy's security systems. They reached the base of the main stairwell, the intersection where the path split toward the containment chamber. Jacqueline held up a fist, signaling a full stop. They huddled into the darkness of the archway, eyes fixed on the heavy doors ahead. The silence was absolute, a heavy weight pressing down on them as they prepared for the final approach. The heavy silence shattered. A piercing, white searchlight swept around the corner, carving a jagged path through the darkness. The group did not hesitate. They slammed their bodies against the cold, unyielding stone of the corridor wall, blending into the deepest recesses of the shadows. The sentry whirred forward, its central lens rotating with a rhythmic, mechanical click. The beam of light sliced across the floor, missing Stephanie's boots by mere inches. They held their breath, lungs burning, hearts hammering against the stone surface. The sentry paused, its internal gears grinding as it recalibrated, the light hovering just feet from where Jacqueline stood frozen. A faint, high-pitched whine emitted from the machine's chassis, vibrating through the floorboards and into their palms. It lingered for an agonizing eternity, the searchlight scouring the alcoves. Then, with a sudden, sharp hiss of hydraulics, the machine turned and trundled away, its light fading into the distance. They remained motionless until the last echo of the metal footsteps died away. Only then did the tension break. They peeled themselves from the wall, checking for any sign of alarm. The path ahead remained clear, but the narrow escape left them hyper-aware of every sound in the hollow, stone-cold belly of the Academy. They reached the threshold of the headmaster's office, where the air hummed with a low, static charge. Jacqueline stepped forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached toward the control panel mounted on the reinforced door. A grid of amber lights pulsed rhythmically, tracking the security status of the entire floor. She leaned in, her gaze locked on the sequence of interlocking circuits. The risk was immediate. A direct, magical intervention could trigger a silent alarm or collapse the containment field prematurely, crushing anyone inside. She traced the lines of energy with her eyes, calculating the feedback loop. The panel was not just a lock. It was a complex web of dampening fields designed to neutralize external magic. She held her hand inches from the surface, feeling the heat radiate from the internal processors. Her pulse quickened as she realized the sensitivity of the connection. One mistake would alert the entire guard force patrolling the western wing. She took a steadying breath, grounding her feet against the stone floor, and began to weave her own energy into the cracks of the system, forcing the panel to accept her presence without alerting the internal sensors. The control panel flickered, then went dark. The heavy door groaned, sliding open just enough to reveal the final corridor leading toward the containment chamber. As they stepped through, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew dense, vibrating with a high-frequency hum that pressed against their eardrums. This was the heart of the dampening field. With every step, the light Jacqueline had been channeling began to fray at the edges, losing its intensity. The magic in the air felt like thick, stagnant water, resisting their movement and leaching the warmth from their limbs. Ruby stumbled, her hand brushing the wall, and the stone felt unnaturally cold. Stripped of all ambient energy, they slowed their pace, fighting the rising lethargy that threatened to pull at their movements. The hum grew louder, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that resonated in their chests, warning them of the containment field's proximity. Ahead, the corridor narrowed, the walls etched with glowing runes that pulsed in time with the dampening field. They pushed forward, ignoring the growing ache in their muscles, their focus narrowing to the heavy iron door at the end of the hall. The final barrier stood before them, vibrating under the strain of the containment magic, shielding the prisoner within. They stopped 10 paces from the chamber door. The air here was so thick with dampening energy that it felt like wading through deep, freezing slush. Stephanie leaned against the wall, her chest heaving, the effort of suppressing the field draining her stamina. She looked back at the group. Ruby was wiping sweat from her brow, her face drawn, while Jacqueline kept her hands low, fighting to keep her own core energy from flickering out entirely. There was no need for words. They had been the rejects of the academy for years, the ones pushed to the fringes because they did not fit the rigid expectations of the elite. That shared history lived in the way they stood, shoulders locked, eyes sharp, guarding each other's blind spots. Stephanie caught Ruby's gaze, then Jacqueline's. They nodded in unison. The fatigue in their limbs did not matter. The risk of being erased from the academy records did not matter. They had survived on the scraps and shadows of this place, and they would not abandon one of their own to the silence of the containment cells. They moved forward together, their formation tight, their resolve shifting from a desperate hope into a calculated, unified intent to tear the door apart. Jacqueline stepped directly in front of the iron door. She did not reach for the handle. Instead, she pressed her palms flat against the cold, vibrating surface. Beneath her skin, violet light began to bleed outward, tracing the faint, glowing grooves of the locking mechanism. This was no simple bolt. It was a complex lattice of interwoven magical seals and mechanical tumblers. She closed her eyes, feeling the jagged pulse of the dampening field trying to swallow her connection. She pushed back, forcing her energy into the narrow gaps between the circuits. The door hissed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed down the hallway. Suddenly, the seal flared, sending a white-hot spark across Jacqueline's knuckles. She flinched, but did not pull away. Her jaw set in a line of iron concentration. She tracked the flow of the seal, identifying the central junction where the magic met the steel. Her fingers twitched, manipulating the internal power currents like threads. The violet glow intensified, bleeding deep into the door's core. She found the primary anchor point, a small, recessed node near the center. With a final, focused surge, she locked her energy onto it, ready to shatter the hold. The hallway behind them groaned as the heavy mechanisms of the academy shifted. Stephanie pivoted, her back against the cold stone, eyes scanning the dark corridor. The rhythmic, metallic clatter of an approaching sentry echoed off the ceiling, growing louder with every heartbeat. She signaled to Ruby, who stepped into position, heels digging into the floor, her hands raised and ready to weave a barrier. They were the shield now. Jacqueline remained locked to the door, her breathing shallow, her eyes never leaving the glowing junction point. The air hummed with the friction of their combined efforts. A shadow detached itself from the gloom at the far end of the hall, the dull red light of an automated patrol sensor blinking in the darkness. It stopped, sensing their presence, and the gears inside its chassis whirred to life. Stephanie did not retreat. She planted her feet, lowered her center of gravity, and braced for the impact. Ruby stood shoulder to shoulder with her, their formation tight and unwavering. They had 3 seconds before the sentry charged, and they would not budge an inch. The silence between them was absolute, a shared promise to hold the line until the lock gave way. Jacqueline did not rush. She drew the ambient magic from the air, pulling the invisible currents toward her palms until the space between her hands began to warp. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and burning dust. Static electricity danced across her skin, raising the fine hairs on her arms, while tiny blue sparks jumped between her fingertips and the cold iron surface of the door. The floor beneath her boots began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that rattled the teeth of everyone standing nearby. She concentrated every ounce of her will into a single point, weaving the chaotic energy into a dense, shimmering sphere of violet force. It pulsed like a living heart, bright enough to cast long, flickering shadows against the academy walls. The sentry at the end of the hall hesitated, its sensors overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the magical pressure. Jacqueline's knuckles turned white as she held the containment, her muscles straining against the weight of the raw power. The corridor darkened as she siphoned the remaining light from the overhead lamps to feed the surge. She stood as a conduit, a living lightning rod, waiting for the exact frequency to shatter the final seal. The energy reached a breaking point, humming with a high-pitched whine that threatened to pierce the silence. Jacqueline thrust both palms forward. The violet sphere collapsed into a concentrated lance of pure force, slamming into the center of the door. For a heartbeat, the lock held. The metal glowed cherry red, warping under the intense heat, while the surrounding stone groaned under the pressure. Jacqueline gritted her teeth, her feet sliding backward as the recoil threatened to throw her off balance. She channeled every remaining reserve of her energy, pushing the surge beyond its threshold. With a sound like a thunderclap in a confined space, the lock disintegrated. A shockwave of white-hot sparks erupted from the point of impact, spraying across the floor like shrapnel. The heavy iron door shuddered, hinges screaming as the frame buckled inward. Fragments of metal embedded themselves into the opposite wall, leaving jagged craters in the masonry. A cloud of acrid smoke billowed outward, obscuring the chamber for a split second. The air rushed into the vacuum created by the blast, carrying the smell of ionized dust and scorched stone. Silence returned to the hallway, broken only by the rhythmic clinking of cooling metal shards hitting the ground. The barrier was gone. The path was open. The static that had hung in the air for minutes dissipated, leaving a sharp metallic taste on the tongue. The smoke cleared, revealing the dark interior of the containment chamber. Ariel did not step out. She fell. Her body hit the stone floor with a dull thud, her limbs heavy and unresponsive after the prolonged confinement. She tried to push herself up, but her hands slipped against the slick, uneven surface. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps that echoed against the high ceiling. Every muscle in her frame ached, pulsing with the dull throb of forced stasis. She attempted to draw on her internal reserves, but found only a hollow, freezing void where her power should have been. Her skin, marked by angry, jagged scrapes from the containment walls, felt tight and raw. She crawled a few inches, her fingers digging into the gaps between the stone tiles, seeking purchase. Her head hung low, sweat dripping from her forehead to create dark spots on the cold masonry. She was entirely exposed, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. The silence of the academy felt heavier now, pressing down on her shoulders. She looked toward the hallway, her vision blurring at the edges as her system struggled to process the sudden freedom. She was not ready to stand, and her body betrayed her, collapsing back against the floor as the exhaustion took final hold. Ruby moved instantly, dropping to her knees beside Ariel. She did not hesitate. She pressed her palms firmly against Ariel's chest, right over the center of the sternum. A soft, emerald light bloomed beneath her hands, spreading like ink in water across Ariel's pale skin. Ariel gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of air that rattled in her throat as the energy made first contact. The green glow pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat that had been dangerously faint. Where the light touched, the jagged scrapes began to knit together, the raw, angry edges of the wounds sealing shut in a matter of seconds. The heat of the magical exhaustion, which had been burning through Ariel like a fever, began to dissipate, replaced by a cooling sensation that traveled through her limbs. Ruby leaned closer, her own brow furrowed with focus, channeling every ounce of her remaining vitality into the transfer. The light grew brighter, casting long, wavering shadows against the stone walls of the chamber. Ariel's breathing smoothed out, the ragged gasps deepening into steady, rhythmic cycles. The tremors in her hands started to subside. Beneath the green glow, the bruises faded from deep purple to a dull, manageable ache. The void within Ariel began to fill, not with raw power, but with a tether of stability. Ruby held the connection, her hands locked in place as the worst of the damage retreated. The emerald glow faded, leaving the chamber dim and quiet. Ariel blinked, her eyes clearing as she sat up, testing the strength in her arms. She looked at Ruby, then at Jacqueline, who stood guard near the shattered entrance. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of their collective breathing. Then, the floor beneath them shuddered. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the hallway, vibrating through the stone and rattling the loose debris scattered across the room. The students froze. Jacqueline turned, her fingers still flickering with faint violet sparks, but her stance shifted into a defensive crouch. The thuds grew louder, closer, faster. Dust, shaken from the ceiling, drifted through the air like gray snow. The group huddled together, backing away from the corridor as the temperature in the room plummeted. A massive silhouette emerged from the darkness of the hallway, blocking the light from the academy lanterns. The headmaster stepped into the doorway, his towering, reinforced frame dwarfing the students. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his presence turning the air heavy and stagnant. His wide, metallic shoulders scraped against the stone doorframe, casting a long, jagged shadow that stretched across the floor to touch Ariel's boots. The space between them became an unbridgeable chasm of iron and intent. The headmaster stood motionless, yet the machine around him began to wake. Deep within the chest plating, a series of heavy gears groaned into motion. A sharp, rhythmic clicking sound filled the chamber, echoing off the stone walls like a countdown. Hydraulics hissed, venting thin plumes of steam that curled into the stagnant air. The wide, plated shoulders of the suit shifted upward, locking into a higher, more aggressive position. From the joints of his arms, metallic panels slid open and snapped back into place, revealing glowing conduits that pulsed with an unforgiving, sterile light. Every movement was precise, calculated, and devoid of hesitation. The headmaster tilted his head, and the visor across his face flickered, cycling through a spectrum of colors before settling on a cold, predatory blue. His fingers flexed, and the metallic plates covering his hands flared outward, extending into sharp, rigid extensions that hummed with a low-frequency vibration. The floor groaned under the sudden shift in the suit's weight as it distributed its power for maximum impact. The transformation was absolute. The bulk of the frame was no longer just an obstacle. It was a weapon system calibrated for total suppression. Gears ground together with a final, definitive thud, locking the entire assembly into a lethal combat configuration. The air in the room seemed to thin, sucked away by the sheer intensity of the machine's activation. The headmaster raised his right hand, fingers splayed toward the group, A high-pitched resonance filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone floor and into the students' boots. Ariel gasped as the fibers of her surroundings began to hum with a sickly, rhythmic glow. She looked down, watching as the threadwork of her peers' presence lit up in tandem with the headmaster's command. The light intensified, turning from a soft pulse to a blinding, jagged glare. Without warning, the material tightened. It was not a gentle squeeze. It was a sudden, violent contraction that pulled at the skin of their limbs. Jacqueline tried to raise her hands to cast a counterspell, but the material locked, pinning her arms against her torso with iron-like resistance. Ruby stumbled forward as the fabric around her knees pulled backward, forcing her off balance. The air in the chamber grew heavy, with the smell of ozone as the energy surged through the threads. Every movement the students attempted only caused the material to constrict further, turning their own presence into a suffocating cage. The headmaster watched, his visor glowing with a steady, predatory blue, waiting for the final collapse. They clawed at the air, struggling against the invisible weight that now dictated their every physical movement. The trap was absolute, binding them to the floor with a force that defied their strength. The pressure spiked. It was no longer a simple tightening. It was a rhythmic, mechanical tugging that dragged their limbs into unnatural positions. Ariel dug her heels into the stone, her muscles straining against the pull, but the fabric only responded by biting harder into her joints. Beside her, Jacqueline tried to pivot, her hands vibrating with residual energy, yet the fabric lashed out like a whip, snapping her arms back to her sides with a sharp, sickening thud. The sound of tearing fibers filled the room. Each student became a puppet to the headmaster's will. Ruby fell first, her legs buckling as the material behind her knees locked, forcing her to hit the floor with a jarring impact. She tried to push back up, but the fabric tightened around her shoulders, pinning her down. One by one, they descended. The floor was cold and unforgiving against their skin. Stephanie gripped her own arms, her knuckles white, as the force dragged her down to join the others. Her breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. They were lined up in the center of the chamber, immobilized, their movements restricted to nothing more than the rise and fall of their chests. The headmaster took a slow, heavy step forward. His suit whirred, the sound dominating the silence of their defeat. They were on their knees, trapped in a configuration of total submission. The headmaster stood over them, the servos in his legs hissing with every adjustment. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from Jacqueline's head, his fingers tracing patterns in the air that tightened the grip on her neck. Ariel gasped, her head forced back by the invisible tension, her eyes searching the room for a way out. Beside her, Stephanie remained motionless. She watched the way Ariel's fingers dug into the stone floor, the skin turning white under the strain. She looked at Jacqueline, whose jaw was clenched against the pain of the restriction. The fear that had kept Stephanie silent for months began to lose its edge, replaced by the sharp, cold reality of their situation. She could see the faint blue light pulsing within the headmaster's chest, a steady rhythm that dictated their fate. She tested her own restraints, shifting her weight just an inch. The fabric bit into her arms, but she held her position, her breath steadying. She looked at the headmaster's back, then down at the small metallic device tucked into her belt. The choice was no longer about survival. It was about the cost of the next 5 minutes. She felt the weight of the room pressing down on her, and with a slow, deliberate movement, she began to reach for her release. Stephanie did not wait for permission. She pulled against the fabric, her muscles burning as she forced her legs to straighten. The material shrieked, fibers straining, but she ignored the resistance and stepped clear of the line. The headmaster's head snapped toward her, the mechanical whir in his neck intensifying into a high-pitched whine. He shifted his torso, raising a hand to pulse a command, but Stephanie was already in motion. She crossed the gap between them, her stride uneven as the remaining fabric pulled at her limbs. She reached into her belt and pulled the metallic sphere free. It felt cold and heavy in her palm. The headmaster tracked her movement, his chest plate glowing brighter, preparing to unleash a surge that would pin her to the wall. Stephanie planted her lead foot, Her gaze locked onto the pulsing blue light on his chest. She did not hesitate. With a sharp exhale, she threw the device. It spun through the air, glinting in the dim light, aimed perfectly at the center of his power source. She braced for the impact, throwing her entire body weight behind the release, and watched as the metal object arced toward the exposed circuitry. The impact was deafening. The metallic disruptor struck the chest plate, and for a heartbeat, the room went silent. Then, the suit began to scream. A jagged bolt of white electricity arced from the point of contact, running through the headmaster's torso like a parasite. He staggered, his heavy boots skidding across the stone as the internal gears seized. The rhythmic clicking of his joints shifted into a harsh, metallic grinding that tore through the hallway. Sparks sprayed in a blinding shower, illuminating the ceiling with every erratic pulse of the failing power core. The headmaster clawed at his own chest, his movements jerky and uncoordinated as if his own limbs were fighting him. The suit spasmed, throwing his body back and forth against the weight of his own armor. A loud, wet crunch of metal hitting metal echoed as a hydraulic line ruptured. Fluid sprayed onto the floor, hissing where it met the electrical discharge. He tried to raise a hand to stabilize, but the arm locked midair, twitching violently. The light in the chest plate flickered from a steady blue to a dying, erratic violet. He hit the heavy iron doors with a sickening thud, his frame collapsing as the final, desperate surge of power failed entirely. Jacqueline did not blink as the metal frame slumped against the iron doors. She saw the opening. The headmaster was pinned, his own weight betraying him as the suit groaned under the strain of the internal malfunction. She stepped forward, ignoring the acrid smell of ozone and burnt wiring that filled the corridor. She held her hands out, palms facing the slumped figure. Her fingers began to bleed light. It started as a thin, flickering violet thread, then thickened into a steady, pulsing glow. A stray spark from the suit arced toward her, but she didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, the violet energy rippling outward to dissipate the rogue charge before it could touch her. She drew a deep breath, pulling power from the very air of the hallway. Her concentration was absolute. The light intensified, turning from a soft glow into a blinding, humming aura that vibrated against the stone floor. She felt the weight of the magic, dense and heavy, gathering behind her ribs. She braced her feet, shifting her weight to anchor herself against the coming recoil. The violet light swirled, coalescing into a singular, unstable point between her palms. The headmaster looked up, his eyes wide behind the visor, but it was already too late. She was ready. Jacqueline thrust her hands forward. The point of violet light between her palms detonated. It did not explode outward in a simple blast, but surged as a focused, physical wall of concussive force. The air in the hallway shrieked as it was torn apart, the sound wave hitting the stone walls and sending cracked spiderwebbing across the masonry. Dust and debris were instantly vaporized or pulverized into a fine, gray mist that hung suspended in the wake of the wave. The floor beneath the group's feet groaned and split, the tiles buckling upward from the sheer atmospheric pressure. Jacqueline's hair whipped violently around her face, her eyes fixed on the target as the violet tide roared down the corridor. It moved with the weight of a rising ocean, a relentless, humming mass of kinetic energy that blurred the vision of anyone watching. The light was absolute, blinding, and suffocating. As the wave surged forward, it bypassed the obstacles of the hallway, carving a path straight through the air. The headmaster, pinned and struggling, had no room to maneuver. The shock wave hit him with the force of a tidal wave, lifting the heavy metal frame from the floor before he could even raise a hand to defend himself. The impact point glowed with a searing, violet intensity, vibrating through the very foundation of the academy. The impact echoed through the academy like a tolling bell. The headmaster hit the heavy iron doors with a bone-jarring thud, his body crumpling against the cold metal. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing and the high-pitched whine of failing hydraulics. Then, the suit began to die. Sparks showered from the joints of his limb housings, glowing bright orange before fading into gray smoke. Gears within his chest piece ground together, metal biting into metal, producing a screeching protest that vibrated against the floor. One by one, The red indicator lights on his gauntlets flickered, pulsed, and went dark. The suit stiffened, locked in a rigid, broken position, before gravity finally reclaimed it. With a final hiss of escaping pressurized fluid, the entire structure collapsed. It buckled at the knees, the shoulder plating caving inward, and the massive frame slid down the door until it slumped into a heap of twisted, smoking metal. Silence rushed back into the corridor, heavy and absolute. The headmaster did not move. The suit was nothing more than a shell now, its power source spent, its mechanisms fused beyond repair. Jacqueline stood, with her hands lowered, watching the stillness, while the scent of burnt circuits hung thick in the stagnant air. The threat was neutralized. Jacqueline did not wait for the smoke to clear. She turned, her boots slapping hard against the stone, and sprinted toward the main thoroughfare. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in a panicked rhythm against the high ceiling. Behind them, the dying suit groaned, a long metallic screeching sound that signaled its final, failed attempt to reboot. The noise pushed them faster. Ariel leaned into the stride, her muscles burning, her focus locked on the distant, arched silhouette of the academy gates. They rounded the corner, feet sliding on the polished floor, and surged into the main atrium. The air here was cooler, smelling of ozone and night. Every second felt like a mile. They passed the rows of empty benches and statues, the sound of their own frantic breathing filling the space. The mechanical clicking that had haunted the hallways for hours was gone, replaced by the rhythmic thumping of their hearts and the distant, fading whine of power cells dying in the dark. They reached the base of the massive double doors, the iron cold and immovable. Jacqueline slammed her hand against the locking mechanism, forcing it to disengage. The heavy doors groaned, shifting outward. They did not look back. They pushed through the narrow gap and burst into the open air, the night wind hitting them with immediate, sharp relief. The grass grew tall and damp against their shins as they put distance between themselves and the stone walls. Ariel slowed her pace, her chest heaving, the sharp sting of cold air filling her lungs. They moved as a single unit, boots crunching over dry twigs and uneven roots, navigating the shadows of the encroaching woods. Above, the moon provided little light, leaving the path ahead to be found by instinct alone. They reached the tree line, the bark rough and solid beneath their palms, and stopped. A collective impulse made them turn. Behind them, the academy sat like a jagged tooth against the horizon. For a moment, the perimeter lights pulsed with a sickly, yellow luminescence, the last remnants of the power grid fighting to remain alive. Then, the hum vanished. The lights flickered once, twice, and died. A heavy, absolute darkness swallowed the entire structure, erasing the windows, the towers, and the sprawling courtyards. The silence that followed was heavy, no longer broken by the rhythmic clicking of patrols or the drone of automated systems. It was a vacuum of sound. The institution, once an inescapable fortress of order, was now nothing more than a hollow, black shape against the night sky. They stood in the quiet, watching the void, finally sensing the distance between their past and the path ahead. The darkness held them now, thick and unyielding. Ariel turned away from the black silhouette of the academy, her gaze finding the others in the gloom. They were silhouettes, defined only by the rise and fall of their chests. Stephanie leaned against a trunk, her hands trembling as she wiped mud from her skin. Jacqueline stood rigid, her fingers still twitching with the remnants of the energy she had channeled, while Ruby remained close to Ariel, checking the last of the fading green light on her palms. No one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of the hours they had just endured. They looked at each other, not as students or captives, but as survivors who had broken the systems designed to contain them. Ariel reached out, catching the rough bark of a tree to steady herself, and felt the others shift closer. The exhaustion was a physical barrier, a dull ache in their bones, yet it was shared. Every scraped limb and bruised rib was a testament to the night. They were outcasts, bound not by choice of allegiance, but by the undeniable reality of their survival. They had burned the bridges behind them, and in this quiet, cold patch of forest, They understood that there was no returning to the life they had known. They were a single, fractured unit, tethered together by the wreckage of their past and the deliberate choice to walk away from it. Ariel took the first step, her boots sinking into the soft, unmapped earth beyond the trees. The group followed, moving in a loose formation, no longer tethered by the rigid protocols of the halls they left behind. They reached a small rise in the ground and stopped to look back one last time. The academy was a tomb of cold, gray stone, silent and lifeless against the rising wind. Stephanie turned her head, her jaw set, and walked past the others into the open expanse. There was no hesitation in her gait. Jacqueline and Ruby joined her, their movements synchronized, no longer checking for sentries or searching for hidden threats in the shadows. The sky ahead was shifting, the deep indigo of night bleeding into the faint, pale gray of the coming dawn. Every step carried them further from the reach of the mechanical suits and the control they had fought to break. They were not running anymore. They were walking with purpose. Ariel looked at the horizon, where the land met the stars, and saw the space for a life defined by their own choices. They crested the hill, leaving the academy behind as a shrinking, dark memory. Ahead, the world opened up, vast and unclaimed. They pushed forward into the light, finally owning the path beneath their feet.